is at the High Court in Stirling Forest this lunchtime. And Sarah, what happens in court today?
Yes, Andrew, within the last few minutes, 28-year-old Christopher McGowan has been found guilty of murder following a 7-day trial here at the High Court in Stirling, which you can see behind me. And that conviction comes almost 2 years on from the death of Claire Ingalls. That driver strangled her, forced a wet wipe down her throat and burned her on her nose, ear and thumb with a lighter or something similar. A forensic pathologist determined that she had 76 external injuries and died from blunt force trauma. Now, a taxi driver also told this trial that the evening prior to the murder, McGowan had been aggressive and derogatory towards. Christopher McGowan was granted bail on 5 separate occasions in the 8 months prior to Claire's death and was laterally released to her property and placed on curfew after his defence argued he was now in a positive relationship. Claire's parents feel that this is something that should never have been allowed to happen. Now, we're not party to all the information that a sheriff would have when making that decision to grant someone bail, but we did speak to several defence lawyers who looked at this case and who looked specifically at the criminal history of Christopher McGowan, which BBC Scotland News had seen, and said that it's likely that the legal system would not have identified him as someone who would be a risk to the wider public. But I put the concerns of Claire's family to the Scottish charity Scottish Women's Aid. Now, Christopher McGowan will be sentenced next month, but Claire's parents say regardless of what length of jail term is handed down. Since the evening of the 28th of November 2021, the night their daughter was murdered, they themselves have been serving their own life sentence.
Sarah, thanks very much.
And Sarah is with us now. You met with Claire's mum and dad. They are living every parent's worst nightmare.
Yes, Laura, I've been speaking with Fiona and Ian Ingalls for almost 2 years now, and they wanted people to know what happened that night. But they also wanted people to know that their daughter was more than what happened to her that night. And they've sat throughout every day of this 7-day trial and, as you said, had their worst fears realised, and they've also had some questions answered. But they do still have a question, and that is how someone like McGowan, with his criminal history, came to be bailed to their daughter's address. Now, today in court, the prosecution asked the judge to consider McGowan's 40 convictions when sentencing, including his 3 assaults and a charge for carrying a knife, as well as his domestic conviction, which I explained during that report. We've approached both the Crown and the Justice Secretary to put the concerns of the Ingalls family to them, but neither wanted to comment on the specifics of the case. But while researching the story, we did speak to several defence lawyers and put the criminal history of Christopher McGowan to them in risk by the legal system. But it's also very important to note that we are not party to all the information that a sheriff would have when making these decisions. Christopher McGowan will be sentenced next month on the 25th of October.
OK, Sarah, many thanks indeed.
8-year-old Christopher McGowan was found guilty of murder. The court was told how McGowan repeatedly struck Claire on her head and body with a screwdriver, strangled her, forced a wet wipe down her throat and burned her on her nose, ear and thumb with a lighter. She had 76 injuries in total. I've been speaking with Fiona and Ian Ingalls for almost 2 years now, since round about the time Claire Ingalls was killed. And one motivation for them wanting to speak with us is because they wanted people to know what happened to Claire that night, but they also wanted people to know that Claire was more than what happened to her that night. She was a loving daughter and a loving mum. Now, throughout the course of the trial, in which they both sat through all 7 days, they've had their worst fears realised and some questions answered, but they do still have questions. Most notably, how Christopher McGowan and someone with his criminal history came to be bailed to their daughter's address, and those concerns were echoed in part by Women's Aid when I spoke to them. Now, today in court, the prosecution asked the judge to consider McGowan's 40 convictions when sentencing, including his 3 assaults and carrying a knife, as well as his previous domestic conviction, which I explained during my report. We've approached both the Crown and the Justice Secretary to put the concerns of the Ingalls family to them, but they say they cannot comment on the specifics of the case. But while researching the story, we did speak to several defence lawyers and put Christopher McGowan's criminal history in front of them. And they said it's very likely that he would not have been identified as a risk to the wider public. But it's also important to know that we are not party to the wider information that a sheriff would have when making the decision to grant someone bail.
And in terms of next steps?
What happens now is that Christopher McGowan is sentenced, and that will happen next month on the 25th of October. But Fiona and Ian Ingalls say that since the night of the 28th of November 2021, they themselves have been serving their own life sentence.
All right, Sarah, we'll leave it there. Thank you indeed.
Thanks.